The proceeding will start shortly. 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 The proceeding will start shortly.
But just before introducing ourselves, I'm required to read out the following for obvious reasons. As you'll know, this session is open to the public. The webcast of the session goes out live and is subsequently accessible via the parliamentary website. A verbatim transcript will be taken of your evidence and put on the parliamentary website. You'll have the opportunity to make minor corrections for the purpose of clarification or accuracy. Now, perhaps you would introduce yourselves for the record, and we can then begin with the questions. Will, we start with you.
My name is Will Moy. I'm the Chief Executive of Full Fact. Full Fact is a charity that seeks to promote informed public debate and known as the UK's independent fact-checking charity.
I'm Jenni Sargent. I'm the Managing Director of an organisation called First Draft. We work internationally. We're also non-profit, and we work to support any information providers who have a role in the information ecosystem to address the challenges of what we refer to as information disorder.
My name is Allan Leonard. I'm the Editor-in-Chief at FactCheckNI, based in Belfast, Northern Ireland. And we were established in 2015, and we're Northern Ireland's first and only dedicated fact-checking service.
And I'm Ed Humpherson, Director General for Regulation at the UK Statistics Authority and Head of the Authority's Office for Statistics Regulation.
Thank you very, very much indeed. First question is for Baroness McGregor-Smith.
Could you tell us what effect misinformation, or I think you've just called it information disorder, has had on public debate in the UK? Could you tell us as well what you feel we've managed to achieve to date that's positive to not have so much of it, but also what the challenges are as well? Over to all of you.
I mean, I can start with referring to information disorder, which is really to reflect the nuance of how complex this challenge is. We all know that the term fake news has become prominent, and that goes nowhere close to reflecting just exactly why we're in this situation. There's no question that the rise of the kind of online space has impacted how information is shared and how the kind of emotional drivers of why somebody would choose to share something are being manipulated. So the lack of opportunity to have any kind of editorial oversight of the fact that anyone can now become a publisher means that at moments when it matters most, sort of times of heightened uncertainty, whether that's a democratic moment, an extreme weather event, a health crisis, then there is an opportunity for anybody who wants to disrupt discourse to utilise some of these online spaces to ensure that their narrative is shifted based on how they want people to perceive information. So we're trying to raise awareness around some of the tactics and the threats that are emerging.
So from the Statistics Authority point of view, we're here to ensure that statistics serve the public good, a kind of reliable and trustworthy evidence base. And in a world in which data, information are abundant, people can feel bombarded by information from all sorts of sources. That sort of velocity of information, we think, creates a kind of Gresham's law risk that the bad data drive out the good data, and that people, in a sense, no longer know what they can rely on and what they can believe in. And we see our role as leaning in against that, but not in an all-purpose way. We're very much focused upstream in the sense that in any kind of exchange of information, there's the producer of the information, the person who's doing the speaking, there's the intermediary who provides the space, the platform, and then there's the hearer, so to speak, the user of the information. And we focus on government as a provider of information, provider of statistics, upstream, providing reliable, impartial evidence base. And of course there are risks to that impartiality. It's our job to inhibit. But we see our role very much in that provision of a reliable evidence base for public use.
FactCheckNI was established to improve civic discourse in Northern Ireland. We were established with a grant to encourage active citizenship and participatory democracy. So we see our role kind of twofold. One is to provide the public free of access fact-check articles, just to set the record straight, but also the education and training of people is very important to us. So we, in regards to, say, achievements, it's the idea not to tell people what to think, but to have people think for themselves. So when we write our fact-check articles and we do our training, we're always imploring the value of critical thinking as a way, as I like to start some of my sessions, training sessions, is to say the best fact-checker in the room is you, because there's no way that any single fact-checking organization is going to fact-check every claim in the world. So it's imperative to educate as many people as possible about the role of critical thinking, and that's how we see a big part of our role.
Bad information can ruin lives. It damages people's health, it promotes hate, and it hurts democracy. To expand on each of those, we see people now suffering from diseases that are curable with vaccines because they have been misled by false information about vaccines and about other public health issues, including, for example, the rollout of 5G technology, mobile communications technology. We see terrorist attacks, sometimes promoted by people who have been radicalized by false information online. And we have communities in this country whose experience of life is really harmed by false information and false beliefs about them, created by misinformation and disinformation, not just online, but in the media too. And of course, it hurts democracy. It hurts people's faith in democracy and hurts people's ability to participate in democracy. We did research during the general election, which we'd be happy to share with the committee, that showed that significant numbers of people choose not to vote because they don't feel able to trust any of the information they're hearing. Now, it's worth saying that not all bad information ruins lives. That is one of the possible outcomes. People being wrong about things on the internet is not a public policy problem that demands a legislative response, but we need to recognise that this is a spectrum of experiences and some of the consequences are very serious. As a country, we should celebrate the many, many things we do right to try to tackle this problem. The fact that we have a still respected and trusted public service broadcaster, in fact more than one of them, they are an important part of having an informed democracy and healthy public debate. The fact that we have freedom of speech, the fact that we have institutions like the House of Commons and the House of Lords libraries informing our public debate, the fact that we stand up for standards in public life when we do, including with organisations like the Office for Statistics Regulation. As a country, we have a lot of building blocks in place that can help tackle the real harms that do come from bad information. By and large, we have yet to move them into the world that we now live in, where instead of having a few sources of information that most people use, most people are experiencing information from thousands of different sources and finding it harder and harder to know what to trust. Full Fact's role in this is in a few places. Firstly, we are a direct source of information for the public. We had 10 million users on our website last year. We have millions more people we serve through partnerships with Sky, ITV, BBC, other media. We're embedded into Facebook, Google Search, and Instagram. We reach millions of people directly. We also challenge people putting bad information into public life. We ask people to correct the record when they need to, whether they're the Prime Minister or a business or a charity, and we get people to correct the record on the record so as to stop the spread of specific unsubstantiated claims. We have a track record of doing that. We made over 100 correction requests last year from our fact-checking. But then we use the evidence from thousands of fact checks, each of those individual experiences of a piece of bad information being made and spreading, to say where are the patterns in that behaviour, in that information ecosystem, and where are the pinch points where changes can actually make a difference to have a healthier, better informed public debate. And it's our job to bring the evidence of that to decision makers who can make a difference, whether that's encouraging Facebook or Google or Twitter to change their policies, whether it's encouraging the Office for National Statistics to communicate its information more clearly so that it's less liable to understood, whether it's working with and training journalists. We look for the places where some people's changes can affect millions of people and improve the quality of public debate.
No, thank you. So a question for the four of you. So with all this information everywhere, we're all citizens. How, during a political campaign, how would you fact check something yourselves on a claim from somebody? What would you do individually? Because I noticed, Anne, you're talking about the critical thinking that we should as individuals apply, but equally so, there's a wealth of information on the web or through... So what do you individually do to check facts are right? I can understand what your organisation does, but what would you do? And what would you suggest citizens do to ensure they get the balanced debate?
Can I give a quick answer to that? Obviously, with my sort of professional hat on, I can give a developed and evolved sort of technical answer. But as a human being, so to speak, my approach is to always try and go the extra click to find out what sits behind a piece of information I'm encountering. So I find that phrase, going the extra click, is a way of reminding myself to have some kind of critical faculties. Yeah.
Well, one model that we have in one of our projects is think, check, share. So as an individual, if I saw a claim before I retweeted it or shared it, I would think. And during the last election here, the general election, both Full Fact and ourselves participated in a news campaign sponsored by Facebook, and it was to promote our toolkits. So it's just basically go to the page and ask yourself 6 questions like, do you trust this? Do you know this source of information? Do you trust it already? Why is this showing in your news feed? Who's to gain from clicking it? So you get those questions in your head. So as an individual, everyone should be thinking about some essential questions.
Yeah, I mean, we work predominantly in the online space, and we prioritise digital verification. But we train journalists predominantly because actually to expect members of the public to be able to develop these skills is unrealistic. There are many things you can do. There are many quick checks you can do to kind of reverse search an image to see when it first appeared on the web. Very often things are taken out of context. And sadly, it's not always as simple as something being true or false or right or wrong. The reason we're in this predicament is because a lot of information that you see will have grains of truth in it. It may be that a video contains a claim that is accurate but is also presented in a misleading way and can be taken out of context. So actually developing these skills when you're up against quite sophisticated tactics is quite a big leap for members of the public to do. I think to echo the point around motivation, certainly personally I always look at the motivation behind it, so whether that's coming from a media outlet or a member of the public. If I've received information online, then I will check to see what their motivation may have been, and then apply, obviously, personally, verification skills to track back the origins of the source.
Sorry, Will, do you want to
say anything?
Well, I'll just add the 3 questions in our toolkit. Where has it come from? what does it really mean, and have you got the whole picture going that extra click, and how does it make you feel, recognising when something is winding you up and recognising that that might be something you need to be cautious about. Those are useful guides for me. Yeah. But as you ask the question on a personal level, the starting point actually is the old maxim that nothing really matters very much and almost nothing matters at all. My starting point is to try to read less news. And actually trying to be constantly informed isn't a particularly helpful thing to do. So I think there is a challenge with the speed of modern information flow and the temptation many of us have to try to keep up with that flow. You can feel like you're becoming more informed, but it's often actually the opposite which is happening. Very few things really matter, and trying to identify the things that really matter and spend your time on them is something that's important to me. But it's also worth saying, and I think I'd speak for anyone on the panel in saying this, we know that even as specialists in this field, we can be deceived. And there is no magic recipe to being able to instantly spot misinformation and disinformation. So recognising your own fallibility as part of the picture.
Very brave. One of the features of local digital democracy software is the ability to have a curated set of uncontested information that people can then focus their debate around. Is there scope for creating that on national questions? It can be really hard for someone who hasn't got a lot of time and doesn't know their way around to find where the data is, let alone what's reliable.
I think the answer is yes, there is scope to do that, and the House of Commons Library and the House of Lords Library both illustrate that that can be done. The Office for National Statistics at its best illustrate that that can be done. What I think all of those also illustrate is that they are primarily serving a certain kind of audience, and the skill is taking that quality of research, that quality of analysis, and the careful structural and individual attempts at impartiality behind it, and translating that for a general audience. There is a reason for BBC's mission is to educate, entertain and inform. The entertain is part of the picture, and until you've got somebody's attention, you can't do anything with the attention. I think there is real skill in good journalism which manages to get people's attention and then do something useful with it. And the high integrity journalism is a really important part of that picture.
So just to build on Will's answer, two points. The first is that if you were to look at the range of work that we do, regulating government statistics, you'll find a kind of a drumbeat from us saying, don't regard the immediate users, the policy users, as the only people who you are serving. In fact, you're serving a much bigger public debate, and that often requires a much more accessible and coherent, linked up way of presenting information. That's the first point. The second point, actually fairly recently, I was giving evidence before the Treasury Select Committee in the Commons about regional imbalances. And the point that I was making there is actually if you wanted to understand the regional balances in the UK economy, you'd have to go to multiple different places. You'd have to go to some GDP figures and some employment figures and some well-being figures and various other things. And it struck me that there's a real service that could be provided by creating these integrated data sets that combine all of those things in one place. So I think it's a very well-made point.
Sorry, if I can pick up quickly around this idea of data voids is a real threat to where we are right now, in as much as people do actively search for information at times when they need it most. And the area that we really need to address is when people proactively search for information, what information is being returned to them at the top of those search results. Because regardless of where this accurate information exists, if that doesn't hit that first three kind of search results, and if there's no indicators of credibility to the public as to why they should understand and believe that information, then really that's an open goal for anyone who is looking to kind of drive a different narrative.
And I'd like to add to this, because in Northern Ireland there was an instance where journalists had used data from NISRA and elsewhere in regards to migration, and the data was correct, but it wasn't in the right context or applied in the best way. So Siobhan Carey and others, Siobhan Carey is the Chief Executive and General Registrar of in Northern Ireland at NISRA, and she and her team identified that part of their role was to make all the data that they collect usable. And I think that's important, is that the statutory obligation not only to collect data, but to actually make it practically usable to the public that they serve. So they created kind of an amalgamation of relevant data products called NI in Profile, Northern Ireland in Profile. And this is to engage with ordinary journalists, so that when journalists are covering a particular topic, they have at hand a kind of ready set of the most relevant data that should be using. I think there is a lot of good scope for this, because of course journalists are an intermediary to a broader public. So this is something that within Northern Ireland I'm exploring to extend.
We really like NI in Profile. I think it's a great product.
Quick question too. In the interest of transparency, could all members of the committee register any interest? Because it's our first meeting since the election, any interest that you might bring to the table ought to be have to be recorded. Estelle.
I can register their interest as a chair and advisor of the Birmingham Education Partnership and a trustee and advisor of the Institute of Effective Education, which is financed by the Boland Charitable Trust. To some extent, question 2 does follow on from some of the answers you've given about how you would respond and try to check the facts yourself. And it's about what expectation we can have of the public in terms of the knowledge and skills they should have in spotting and not spreading misinformation. And I think you've already said how difficult it is. And when I listened to what you did, I kept thinking, well, can we really expect every member of the public to develop those skills and to be able to do that on every single occasion in which they come into contact with data? So is that an expectation too high? What should be our expectations as to the skills that the public have? And I suppose the answer has got to be education, but can education meaningfully reduce the spread of information, or does identifying misinformation require an amount of expertise or time commitment that perhaps it's not to be expected from the general public?
Controversially, I completely agree with you, and there is a big push in our industry at the moment around media literacy, and this idea that it will be the kind of saving grace and we just have to integrate it into school curriculum and then we'll be fine. And I think the expectation on the public, considering the sophisticated tactics at play, people are being deliberately targeted with very advanced techniques in order to persuade, and tactics of persuasion are historically driven by lots of different kind of skills that most people who, when consuming news, I think there is an element of kind of digital literacy and an understanding potentially of the motivations, but there's so many different factors at play that it's definitely, from my point of view, the responsibility of the platforms and the publishers to provide indicators of credibility, as opposed to from the consumers of information who can't be expected and shouldn't be expected to kind of perform these additional checks with everything they see. It doesn't feel realistic. It's not the way that we normally communicate. We have none of the verbal or visual clues that kind of normally accompany communication. So the reason that we have these emojis now is to help people understand sentiment when messaging online. Most pieces of information, when they're presented in Facebook and other online news forms, have none of those indicators that we might recognise, such as the newsprint font or the colour of the paper of the Financial Times, for example. We have no indicators to suggest why something on Facebook is presented differently than another thing. I think we can certainly and should inform around some of these issues from school age, but as we start to discuss the threats and challenges of misinformation, I think it's a giant leap to think that media literacy is going to solve the problem.
Well, I do advocate media literacy, and I've had this discussion elsewhere in regards to the role of technology platforms versus the education of the public, so it's a supply and demand kind of issue. I'm not disagreeing in regards to that there is no silver bullet that's going to resolve this. A lot comes down to trust, and trust is a very difficult thing to achieve and to standardize. I would just make a distinction between claims that are made in the public versus the micro-targeting. So I would, this is my own view, that claims that are made in public, that are broadcast publicly, those I think, media literacy and a general awareness and fact-checking organizations can respond to very promptly. I think, though, in regards to resolving the issue of micro-targeting political adverts and any other form of advertising will be a bigger challenge, and I don't think education on its own is going to resolve that. I think there obviously needs to be much more transparency about who is targeting whom, why, and who's to benefit. And that's where I think some of the software solutions could play a role.
Full Fact is a charity which ultimately is about citizenship. And in a democracy, we are all members of the general public, and we are all the most important people in a democracy. We have to believe in the role of the individual citizen as an important part of having a healthy democracy. And absolutely, our skills, our knowledge, the information we have is a central part of that. So yes, I think that education is a part of the response to this challenge. But we have to think about what the goal is. If the goal is to eliminate belief in things that aren't true, firstly, that's a remarkable thing for a government to set its mind towards, and I think doesn't stand up to much scrutiny. And it's obviously dangerous, and it's obviously impossible to go down that road. So the goal, I think, is to reduce harm from false and misleading information by taking proportionate steps, in the same way that any form of regulation tries to be a proportionate response to clearly identified harms. In that sense, some information matters more than others. Before you share something which purports to be a cure for cancer online, you might start to think that you have a higher responsibility than when you share something that purports to be a video of a cat jumping over the Empire State Building. I think people are capable of making these distinctions. And I think we perhaps need to think about the frictionless environment for sharing information and ask people to think more clearly about sharing one thing is not an equivalent choice to sharing something that could have real impacts for people's health or people's votes or people's financial choices or things that really affect people's lives. The case against education is easy to make. If you educate school kids, then it takes 50 years to filter through to the whole population and actually make a difference. The generation most likely to vote is 50 years away from school, not 5 years away from school. Education is not perfectly recalled. We essentially cannot educate the adult population in any kind of sit down for a long while and gain new skills way. There's no scalable way of doing that. It's very easy to point out the difficulties and point out the reasons why education is not a sufficient response to this problem. I think the challenge is to find what is the one sentence of advice that we could tell everybody to think about. What is the stop, look and listen that has a proper research base behind it that might be a useful first step for everybody? It might be take the next click, for example. That could be a useful thing. And absolutely, we have evidence that the right educational interventions can make a difference into people's choices and that can be a sustained difference. Ofcom is running something called the Making Sense of Media Advisory Board at the moment. I'm a member of it. It's a civil society group trying to coordinate the many, many efforts on media literacy that are going on at the moment. We're very pleased they've done that. That coordination is necessary. It now has an evaluation subgroup which is specifically focused on understanding what is effective in this area. I think that's a really good place to start. It is notable that the Department for Education is not actively involved with that effort at the moment. And while I recognise the many pressures on the curriculum and the trade-offs of putting anything into the curriculum or taking it out, and the fact that teachers are already trying to improve critical thinking, it's not like teachers haven't thought about this. Nonetheless, I think that the Department for Education ought to be actively involved in those conversations and thinking about its role in them.
A non-executive director at the Department of Education, so I will feed that back to them, but I think it's something that we will definitely pick up with them.
I felt a crack record in a sense saying this, but 17 years ago, Ofcom were given statutory responsibility for this, and we are where we are. How is that possible?
I think for two reasons. One is that the statutory responsibility, Ofcom has many statutory responsibilities, and I'm not sure they saw this as central to their role in the 17-year-old information environment, which was essentially about 5 TV channels and 10 newspapers and understanding your way around them. I think Ofcom has increasingly started to recognise that media literacy is a strategic necessity for the future in Ofcom, and that it has moved from something that needs to be part of their role to something that actually needs to be thought about as a much more central part of that role. I can't speak for them, but that's my impression of the way their thinking might be developing. I think the reason for that is that media literacy, whatever we mean by it, is harder than it used to be because the information environment around us has changed.
Ed, anything you'd like to add to Barrister
I mean,
Morris's
this is really not my area of focus. As I said, I focus upstream on the provision, creation and dissemination of statistics. But I do think about this as a kind of a value chain with the producer, the intermediary and the hearer. And I think to focus on digital literacy as a kind of mitigation puts a lot of onus just on the hearer, on the person who's receiving, and of course it's an important condition that people have the confidence and the kind of the kind of mnemonics, the kind of rules of thumb, like Allan was mentioning. But you can only be literate if there's something that's readable. There's no point. Literacy without something which is readable is meaningless. And I think that's why you have to think about this in a holistic sense, not simply equipping people with digital literacy, but thinking about what the intermediaries do to make the information provided checkable, verifiable, digital imprints, and thinking about what the providers do to make the information accessible and meaningful.
Just one quick. We'll come on to this later on. So, David, Chair, you think it can be answered later, but I tend to be where you are, Jenny. Because I just think it's different than anything else we've tried to teach, and I don't think we've actually come to terms with that yet and worked it out. But is there a bit of a problem in our ever doing this when we've not actually decided what we're trying to do? So if we can't, in that question, and I can see how difficult it is, and my head's there as well, decide whether it's possible to educate every citizen to fulfil that role as active, discerning citizens, or whether we've got to put something else in place. And this is what I think I was asking you. If it is the alternative that we have to trust the intermediary organisations, how confident are you that you're working in a sector where people are willing to be checked and be verified and have that little tick that says the public can trust you?
Interesting point, because we work predominantly at the moment with journalists, and our goal is to bring the journalists together to agree some form of kind of transparent indicators that will help their audiences understand why their work can be trusted. And that could be as simple as kind of the transparent process that kind of demonstrate the principles that underpin good journalism. This kind of merging that we have now, that you can't believe anything, and that journalism itself is potentially being undermined, is a real issue. And my concern is kind of without my fact-checking colleagues do extraordinary work, but I worry that fact-checking is becoming an industry in its own right, and actually there's potential threats around the value of journalism and understanding good journalism. We have an initiative called Crosscheck, which is built around this idea that the newsrooms endorse and verify each other's work. So these kind of logos go side by side to demonstrate to the public that it's not just one outlet that believes this, that actually it has been agreed and verified by a number of outlets and potentially other expert organisations. So World Health Organization, for example, might be a logo that appears to say that they also endorse this. So I think my frustration is, again, when it comes to where the onus of responsibility lies, the producers of information, particularly around the topics that Will highlighted, this should be kind of ingrained in the production of the material. So we recognise a copyright symbol, for example. We begin to understand what that means, and I don't think a symbol in its own right, whether it's a tick or that's not enough for sure. But if that can be a kind of instinct that whenever you see that, you can click it and it displays the information in more detail, and the producers of information are kind of compelled to show their work in that way, then we come some step forward. So instead of asking people to do the checks themselves, they simply just can have quick access to the information they need.
Lord Lucas.
Yeah, in a way, that's answered the question I was going to ask, which is, if you're looking up something, I just flipped into what's the suicide rate among transgender people. First thing you get is Stonewall with a completely rubbish statistic. There's nothing in the rest of what Google is offering you offers you any opportunity to check that. And how many members of the public really know statistics anyway? And half the stuff you want is behind a paywall. So there really has to be something that makes it easier for people, as Ed Humpherson says, to do one click onwards, but not 101 clicks onwards. And do you think that's something which the big media companies would support.
Sorry, I was just going to say the idea of being accountable to each other is something that I would really like to encourage, but I'll pass on.
I would just add what Will has referred to in regards to the BBC as a public broadcaster and its duty to inform. So FactCheckNI, we participated with the BBC in their schools report program, the young reporters program in Derry, Londonderry, a couple of years ago. And that's a good example about how the BBC can work with fact-checking organizations and others in regards to educating children about trustworthiness and transparency. Also, we participated in the FactCheck EU program during the European election on the back of the cross-check program, where FactCheckNI and other fact-checking organizations worked with media organizations to kind of scrutinize claims that are being made across all of Europe. So I think it can be done. I'm pausing because I think this committee should consider who are the catalysts, who are the champions. Is it BBC, Ofcom? Who are the conduits to try to bring together evidence, research-proven, effective measures?
Next question from Lord Holmes.
Thank you very much, Chair. Good morning, and declare my interest as a member of the board at Channel 4 Television. One of the characteristics of information that achieves public trust, how can we ensure that the public trust and accept high-quality information such as national statistics, and indeed can differentiate between legitimate and illegitimate sources of information?
I'll start with that one. We think that it's always a mistake to regard statistics as just numbers. They're numbers with a social life. They exist in a context, and we've therefore embedded into the code of practice, which all government departments must comply with, three concepts. One is that they must be trustworthy, and that's not about the statistics themselves. That's about the signals that the organisation gives about the impartiality with which they've compiled their statistics. Trustworthiness, you'll be familiar with that concept because you heard evidence from Baroness O'Neill, who's really the progenitor of the thinking here. So trustworthiness. Quality, which is what are the data, where are they from, how are they collected, what are the inherent biases which must be recognised in them. But most importantly, in a sense of value, which is what are the questions that this information is available to answer. And those three pillars, trustworthiness, quality and value, underpin our thinking about everything. And I think the key thing about them is they are about statistics having much more than just being a sense of numbers. They are numbers that are produced by people in organisations, and they are provided to people to understand the world. They're numbers with a social life. And we think recognising that and not kind of cleaving the statistics out of their context and regarding them just as kind of like a clickbait number, the big number to win the argument, I think is the key to creating a trustworthy environment.
So, after you.
Oh, pardon. So, Full Fact and FactCheckNI are both verified signatories of the Code of Principles set forth by the International Fact-Checking Network at the Poynter Institute. And I can summarize this in one sentence. Trustworthiness is reflected in our commitment to nonpartisanship and fairness, to transparency of sources of information, to transparency of funding, and our organizational details, how we are run. So a lot of those are kind of qualitative, but we get independently assessed every year, and we have to show evidence that we've satisfied each of those criteria. I think it all does, to answer the question about trust, trust is earned, but you do need to provide sufficient evidence, and the evidence that you produce may not be sufficient to the public. That's life.
Question back to you, my lords. Let's imagine you are taken away on away day. I doubt they do that for House of Lords Select Committees, but you're taken away on an away day, and you are asked to do the trust game of falling back into one another's arms. And you do this game 100 times. 99 times you successfully catch the fellow member of your committee, and then the 100th time you drop them. Do you think they will ever trust you to do that game again? Trust is not a single thing. It's a collected set of experiences. It's the sum total of your experiences of an organisation or a source or a piece of information. It is, as people say, easily lost. And I think what we often forget in this area is that government is losing that trust on a very regular basis, saying things that aren't trustworthy and giving that trust away and sacrificing it. The media, on a regular basis, does that, and so do many other powerful actors in public debate. And people remember. And so people's default and rational response to this situation is to be generally distrustful. Only about 1 in 5 of us generally trust politicians to tell the truth. Only about 1 in 5 of us generally trust journalists to tell the truth. That doesn't mean we think they lie all the time. It thinks we lie enough that it's not sensible to trust them. Just as if you're a non-executive member of a board and you get misled by the people who report to you, you would very quickly become distrustful of them. So that's my first concern in this area. My second is about the person who was most trusted to give information during the EU referendum. I don't know if you know who that was, but according to a poll the October before the referendum, the answer was Martin Lewis, the money-saving expert. Martin Lewis, let's be honest, knows nothing about Britain's relationship with the EU. He is an extremely knowledgeable, extremely thoughtful man, but that is not his area of expertise. He is, however, easily identifiable, well known to people. People have a consistent record of trusting him to give them advice about something that's important to their life for years, i.e. their finances. And he's clearly on your side. If I start looking at public debate for the people and institutions who are identifiable, knowledgeable, and clearly on your side, I come up with a very short list indeed. So we need to start thinking about what public institutions can be trusted in that way and how we're going to make them stand out. Things like the Institute for Fiscal Studies at one end of the spectrum, things like public service broadcasters at another end of the spectrum. We need to recognise how valuable those voices are in our public debate and protect them and build on those extraordinary assets we have in the UK that some other countries don't have. And then the third thing I would say, my third vignette if you like, is about Lidl, the supermarket. As you may know, not everybody believes that Lidl sells the best quality food. They get a certain amount of grief about it online. Lidl did something interesting. They did a series of adverts called Lidl Surprises. You can find them on YouTube. They put on TV, national TV, tweets that people had sent saying this food must be rubbish. And then they say, well, OK, come and see it. And so there's a lovely ad where a woman who has tweeted critically of Lidl's steaks is taken up to Scotland to see the farm, to meet the cow, to meet the farmer, to try the steak, hopefully not from the same cow that day, I don't know. And at the end says, I'm sorry, I was unfair to you. And so the whole story is shown from beginning to end so that people can make their own minds up about it. Now, there was a time, perhaps, although I don't believe it, when people would just defer to authority and take your word for things. But we all know that that time is over. What we haven't adjusted to, particularly in the public sector, is the need to tell the whole story so that people can make up their own minds about it. From those original sources that Ed is talking about, reassuringly boring spreadsheets with reassuringly normal statisticians looking at them, no hidden agenda, telling that whole story so that people can see it, make their own minds up about it and trust it in a two-way conversation, not in a hand-down from an old-fashioned source of authority. So those are my thoughts on trust. Firstly, it's easily broken. Secondly, we need identifiable, expert people who are on your side. And thirdly, we need to tell the whole story so people can make up their own minds about what to trust.
Jenny and then Lord Scriven.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm a bit concerned about the kind of perceived elitism aspect of when we discuss this. I mean, there is a challenge here. People, I believe, trust things when they feel safe and comfortable. There is a tribalism element to some of the online debate that we witness, which is that sense of, obviously deferring to the information that confirms your own belief and feeling safe and trusted in that environment. We're seeing a rise of misinformation spreading within these closed, trusted groups on these closed messaging apps, like WhatsApp, for example, where these smaller trusted groups of peers and family are, that's what we mean by trust. So I completely agree that these institutions that are sort of driving this kind of accurate information are essential, but at the same time, if we don't understand the kind of narratives that play around why people might choose to believe something, then I think we just need to bear that in mind.
Can I just add one thing very quickly? I mentioned earlier the importance of going the extra click, and so to indulge in a little bit of very real-time fact-checking, I think Will was quoting figures about the trust, who people trust to tell the truth. And I think you were quoting, Will, from the Ipsos Mori Veracity Index. We shouldn't despair, because there are some professions that people increasingly trust to tell the truth, including scientists and also civil servants, where people have consistently increased the rate at which they trust civil servants to tell the truth from 40% in 1983 to over 65% in the most recent survey. I think that's just an interesting observation that actually giving signals of trustworthiness does sometimes work.
Thank you. Paul. Jenny kind of took the words out of my mouth. I've been sat here thinking this is a very sterile debate we're having about institutions. If you start looking at the statistics of ethnicity, of age, etc., of social class, some of the institutions that you're talking about just don't relate to people's real lives. So the issue is beyond... So my first question is, have you got any evidence that the fact-checking and what you do actually does change people's minds from irrationality to a more rational view about what's true? And if so, what's the breakdown of gender, ethnicity, etc.? And secondly, beyond that, to use your words, Will, we've got to get into the world that we live in now. A lot of people actually, when they're given a fact, completely refuse to believe it because of the stuff that Jenny's just said about closed WhatsApp, where they're going. So is there anything above what you can do which can augment that quite deeply held view that no matter how many facts you give them, they're not going to believe it? And we talked about some of those issues about citizenship, etc. But is anything particularly about the online digital world that needs to be done? And it comes back to Ed's point about it's not just the consumer of the information that is quite key in this, because they do seem to play quite a large balancing act between that information giving as well as those who are receiving it.
I think that's exactly the right challenge. Last year, it might be the year before now, Full Fact, Africa Check and Curated issued a joint statement called Fact Checking Doesn't Work the Way You Think It Does. If you believe that fact checking can work by simply giving people information and people reading those fact checks if they do and then changing their minds, you are on a hiding to nothing. Most of our work and most of the change we are trying to achieve is upstream. It's asking people to correct the record and stop the spread of specific unsubstantiated claims. It's looking at the causes of bad information and trying to tackle them. And yes, 10 million users came to our website last year, and yes, we know that it served some of them very well. We got a phone call from one woman who said that she had gone online to try to work out whether to vaccinate her children, and she couldn't find any information she trusted. And then she found our work, she felt able to trust it, and there are 2 children now who are vaccinated who wouldn't have been without the information she found from Full Fact. So we know it can make a difference to people. But we also know, as you say, that people don't just process information, they process it in a social context. And we all process it through our psychological biases and our emotional predispositions. If you want to change people's minds at scale, you would never choose fact-checking as the way to do that. What you would do is a biased campaign that targets people's emotions. If you want to change people's attitudes to NHS spending or immigration or the right balance of public spending and taxation or whatever, then pick a fight and join in the fight. And that's what a democracy is. If you want to convince people of things, yes, you should use facts, and facts are part of convincing people, but you should also use emotions and all the techniques of campaigning and communications. So fact checkers aren't the answer to how you get everybody to believe things that are true. We're part of the answer to how you give people the opportunity to make up their own minds about what is true and what isn't, and part of the answer to how you challenge people in positions of power and responsibility when they choose to mislead others or when they accidentally mislead others. But the idea that there is anybody which could kind of sit in some central position, bestow accurate information on the world and be gratefully thanked for it is borderline silly, to be honest. And it surprises me how many people look at fact-checking through that lens, because I just don't think it's a viable interpretation. The accountability function is a crucial part of what we do.
Yeah. I apologise, I've got a short question but a long list of interests I have to read out. That I'm a commissioner on the UN Broadband Commission for the Sustainable Development Goals, a member of the Technical Board We Protect Global Initiative, member of the Council on Extended Intelligence, member UNICEF Artificial Intelligence Child Rights Policy Guidance Group, chair of Five Rights Foundation, and speak on digital technologies and childhood.
Just before you do, just for the record, I also give my declaration, which is I'm the Vice President of the Local Government Association. I forgot to do that. Sorry.
Fantastic. Interruption of service. No, I'm very interested in this idea of the value chain. So there's the producer of the information, there's the intermediary, and then I very much like your word hearer rather than user, but at the other end. And I was equally struck by the fact that all of your institutions have a set of values or a set of principles. And I just wanted to ask, what set of principles could the intermediaries adhere to that would help drive a more healthy relationship between verified producers and hearers? Because I think that's the bit that we're getting least action on in this conversation. And yet we know they're a very powerful force in how we receive information.
I'll attempt that from a slightly different angle. So fact-checking can be described as explanatory journalism. The ambition is to try to put claims and facts into a context. A lot of daily journalism is just getting the daily story out and the daily narrative. Now, we're based in Northern Ireland, and there's some debate about the role of media, broadcast media, during the Troubles and post-Troubles. And I attended a conference in Belfast recently, and the thing that came across listening to journalists from South Africa was, in regards to principles and values post-apartheid, was duty of care and harm. And they revised their kind of editorial guidelines to make sure that where they send their reporters and the story selection and how they cover the stories, they have a duty of care and duty of harm, to do no harm. As you mentioned, Baroness, I think we all have that at this table. I would love to see more media outlets pay a little more attention to that role of duty of care and do no harm in the stories that they cover.
Just to pick up on that, I'm interested that this is quite nuanced, because Facebook and other platforms have directed the behaviour of some news outlets because of the financial incentives and the way that the information landscape has shifted. So I do think, in terms of responsibility, some of these news outlets are having to adopt more, as we all know the term clickbait. It's potentially not appropriate to use that to refer to all news organisations, but there's definitely a drive to become more competitive in a smaller online space. You know, how do you drive visitors and viewers to your website when you're in much more of a sort of small, aggressively competitive space? So I think for the platforms themselves, they need to be providing a better way for those information providers who do demonstrate credibility to not reduce themselves to some of these tactics that would drive users and viewers, because I think that is part of kind of muddying the waters. I think the financial incentives across the board are the real issues here, because you have, you know, everyday users online in most of these free spaces, but then the paid for advertising does mean that you can kind of leapfrog any of these tactics and get your messages and narratives, sometimes without the transparency that is needed. So I think I'm always shocked at how the platforms don't refer to the news industry more frequently to learn from what they've gone through in terms of how to report, you know, whether to show the moment of death, or whether to, you know, what decisions have been taken through, you know, years of experience from the newsrooms that now don't get applied to the online spaces because they refuse to consider themselves a publisher. And I would like them to consider themselves a publisher.
Reverse the events question to you, because you're an immensely trusted organisation. What keeps you awake at night in terms of what could seriously damage the credibility of your organisation? So how could you emerge as, oh, Jesus, we've just become part of the problem instead of part of the answer?
What keeps me awake at night is that I think that so many official statistics have the potential to be a really valuable asset for the public, and not just, you know, the policy elites, but much more broadly. But that potential is unrealised because they're presented and communicated in a very dry and kind of almost mechanical way. We did this survey and we got these results, and not presented in a way which engages and links into the things that people are concerned about. I worry much more about that than I do about the sort of more pervasive concerns people have about misinformation. I worry about the good information not getting out there.
Well, very shortly.
Quickly on a point of information, and then to Baroness Kidron's point. On a point of information, only about half of people generally trust that statistics on employment and immigration are produced without political interference. And going to Lord Scriven's argument, there is a clear demographic skew in where that trust lies. So I think we need to be very careful. The OSR, the Office of Statistics Regulation, is rightly a very trusted organisation. So as the ONS, the Statistics Authority, we need to be very careful about where the limits of that trust are in practice. On Baroness Kidron's point, it's a huge question. And the starting principle that these organisations should be embodying, in my view, in a free society, is free speech. And we need to be very careful that proportionate responses to real harms don't crowd out free speech. The idea that those companies are best placed to work out where that balance lies in all of the different countries around the world in which they operate is laughable. They are doing so because Parliament has failed to act. So instead of having an open, democratic, transparent process defining where that balance lies in the UK, we have Mark Zuckerberg and Jack Dorsey and the rest of them. I don't think that's acceptable, but the responsibility for it is yours. I absolutely think that these internet companies should be providing proportionate responses to real harms. They should be actively monitoring harmful content on their platform and responding. I don't think that they are capable of defining where that line is without democratic oversight. What is a harm that qualifies for intervention and the suppression of somebody's speech, and what is a harm that doesn't? That's a decision I would like to see taken with democratic accountability, not just in a corporate situation. To their credit, they have also called for that to some extent, and it is about time we acted.
Thank you very much indeed. Mike German.
Can I first of all declare my interest as Treasurer of the Liberal Democrats? Can I also try and tease out a little bit about your answers to is what's happening credible and your role within it? You've already mentioned, of course, your connection, particularly you will, with the technology companies, and clearly one might assume that the public might feel that you are associated with the government. I mean, it might be that because that's the way that it would appear for a statutory body or whatever. Can you outline for us what you think are the credibility advantages and disadvantages of either being connected with government or connected with a technology company in any way whatsoever? And if you've got any solutions to the issue of about the weaknesses of how misinformation flows through that would be helpful.
Well, okay. Let me start perhaps by declaring interest on behalf of Full Fact in that case. Full Fact receives funding from Facebook. We have grant funding from Facebook for work we're doing promoting technology for fact checkers internationally and AI in this area. We have funding because we fact check content on their platform at their request to help them identify and respond to false information on their platform. We have funding from Google. We were winners of the Google AI for Social Good Impact Challenge, which was a global challenge with entrants from more than 100 countries. We are one of 20 winners for artificial intelligence in this area. We do not take government funding, but we have previously worked with the UK Statistics Authority and the Economic and Social Research Council, both of which are independent from government but ultimately taxpayers' money. So just so you're aware of the background here, all of our funding is declared on our website and available for the committee or anyone else to inspect. The nature of being an organisation that seeks to promote accountability in a complex and contested field like public debate is that you will be rightly scrutinised, and you have to think about every partnership and interaction you have very carefully. When we work with a major media organisation, we also fact check them. Sometimes we have to ask media partners of ours to correct the record, including in the heat of a general election. When we work with the internet companies, we also come here and tell you what's wrong with their work. When we chose to work with Facebook, our condition for working with them was that we would publish a regular transparency report on their third-party fact-checking program saying how it worked and how it needed to improve. We published the first one last July after 6 months. We're drafting the second one now. That was our way of maintaining our independence visibly and also making sure that our participation in that program helped us drive improvement rather than just be part of it. We also work with the government. We work with the Government Communications Service, which is at the front line of some of the tackling of disinformation, and particularly state-sponsored disinformation. But the Government Communications Service is also one of the major providers of disinformation in this country, as the voice of its political masters. So all of our relationships are complex, and all of our relationships involve having to maintain integrity in a place where people could reasonably doubt what's going on and what that relationship is. All we can do is behave to the best of our ability, have good governance in place. We have a cross-party board of trustees which scrutinises all of our work, and hope that our actions and our efforts to explain our actions to the public are sufficient for people to place trust in us. But it is a complex field, and it is difficult to get those judgments right.
I'm sorry to interrupt him before we've heard from everybody else, but you haven't answered that one question, which is, does it make you more or less credible to the listener or the hearer?
It makes it more credible to us providing evidence about how the internet companies behave and how that can be improved, that we have worked with them and that we are known as expert by them and that we have information about what spreads on some of those platforms because of our work with them. It makes us more credible to, when we're talking to, for example, public information bodies about how to communicate effectively in the online world, that we work with the internet companies. It makes us more credible to the internet companies when we say to them, we want to publish a transparency report on your programs, that we work with government and we understand the policy environment that affects them. It makes us more credible to media organisations that we work with the internet companies and vice versa. So there is a sort of chain of credibility in that somewhere, because we work with the top-tier organisations in all of these fields. We work with the House of Commons Library, the ONS, the public information bodies. We work with top universities. We work with the top internet companies. We work with the top broadcasters and media outlets. We have something to offer in all of those areas. The problem, of course, is each of those organisations is suspicious of each of the other organisations in that chain. And so what they have to see from us as well is something that demonstrates our independence from every organisation we work with. Ultimately, you'd have to ask other people how we're regarded, but the evidence so far is that all of those organisations are willing to trust us and willing to some extent to trust their reputation in partnership with us.
Dr. Allan as well. Did you have anything to add to what was just said, the specific to your organisation, as opposed to the generality of it?
Nothing to add. I mean, we are also funded by the platforms. We recognise that anyone within the information ecosystem needs to be part of this discussion, and collaboration is the only way that we can bring all of those stakeholders in. I should just add that one of our biggest complex challenges, because we work internationally, no two governments are the same, no two news organisations are the same, no two media landscapes really are comparable in terms of who we might consider a credible kind of contributor to this discussion. So it is something that we're continuously trying to evolve the principles and guidelines around.
Yes, like Will explained, FactCheckNI is also a partner organization with the Facebook third-party fact-checking program, similar provisos, but I need to discuss that FactCheckNI is also a part of a European Commission research project, Horizon 2020, called Co-Inform, and we're among a partnership of universities and research institutions. We're there as practitioners. So the credibility comes from research efforts that are exploring this, getting an input from those of us on the ground actually doing the work, and we can feed back from our experiences, but also drawing upon the global fact-checking community of what's been shown to actually work elsewhere.
Ed, any?
I'm glad this question came up because I was hearing that everybody else had interests to declare and I was feeling left out that I didn't have one. I suppose I should say we are a taxpayer-funded body. It's an enormous privilege to be a statutory body and having an act behind us, and we think it confers on us a real responsibility to show that we act in the interests of the public. And one of the ways that we think we need to be very judicious is in not politicising our interventions. That's not to say we do not make statements which are uncomfortable for one or other of the political actors, the political parties. We do that, but we're very parsimonious in doing that so that anybody looking at us can see an even-handedness in how we form our judgments.
Just two final questions, running out of time. I have to declare an interest, and it's a very specific one actually. I sit on the advisory board of Accenture Ireland, which makes the question rather pointed. How well does Facebook's partnership with the fact-checking organisations work? Should it be emulated by other technology companies, and what can we learn from approaches taken by some of the other companies?
Should we do it from the point of view of the members and then you can do it from the outside? So, as I said, Full Fact publishes transparency reports on the third-party fact-checking programme. The last one included 10 recommendations for Facebook about how the programme should improve. Our basic view is that the third-party fact-checking programme is a valuable measure, which is particularly effective and particularly useful in certain areas, such as tackling election interference, tackling false information in the aftermath of emergencies, such as terrorist attacks, and tackling health misinformation, things where clear-cut action is called for. We think it should be adopted by other internet platforms. We recommended that Facebook extend it to Instagram in our last report, and they have done that, which we are pleased to see. We think other internet companies should follow suit. The two challenges we raised for Facebook thematically were they need to be more transparent about the programme and how well it works, and allow that to be assessed independently. And we need to talk about how we scale that up, because this is an internet scale challenge. So that is our broad view of the programme, and as I said, we are currently drafting our second transparency report on the programme.
Jenny.
I have some concerns about it, actually. It's come a long way since it was first evolved at the beginning of 2015. There's no question that it does have value. I do have concerns around whether it's scalable. I think there are real issues around content moderation that is being outsourced by the platforms, and I can't see how this doesn't just fall into that kind of expansion of what they refer to as third party, but it is a direct relationship of Facebook paying organisations. There's a direct financial relationship which raises questions around incentives and how you can ensure that there isn't some kind of financial incentive to publish a fact check. And even though IFCN, as Allan referred to, has some excellent principles, and there are it's a very thoughtful organisation around how to address some of these challenges, I do worry that it's impossible to, there are organisations that are sprouting up to become fact-checking organisations in order to receive this financial compensation. And this risk around erosion of trust, if all we're doing is publishing what's not true, I'd like to make sure that there is a similar stream which is about accurate reporting and ensuring that we are raising awareness around what is true and not just what isn't.
Yeah, let me pick up on that because that's one of our major concerns. So generally, FactCheckNI, we're content with our participation. The volume of our work is smaller just because of an economy of scale representing a smaller population. Positively, the participants are verified signatories of ISN code, and that's good. So even the expansion will have to go through that third-party process. But as the previous two speakers have said, my concern, not concern, but it's a challenge in regards to Facebook is global. And so a kind of one-size-fits-all approach is not going to work because of a variety of cultural, operational, and legislative frameworks, and we all just need to remember that. Also to a reputational risk in the sense that Facebook will not apply treatment or financial payment for anything they deem political. And that's fine in the sense that that is their policy. So you have to challenge them on their policy. The reputational risk is that the wider public can misassociate a fact-checking organization as not doing political fact-checking. And that's just not true. The majority of our fact-check work is political speech. It's just that speech isn't eligible to be considered. So that's a risk I identify. Likewise, the bias, I'm very concerned about even trying to improve algorithms and learning. If you're only feeding it, feeding the algorithm evidence of claims that have been proven false or partly false, that does actually little to educate anyone about the effectiveness of fact-checking. So at FactCheckNI, when we research any claim, we will publish the verdict regardless of what the verdict is. If it's accurate with consideration, inaccurate consideration, inaccurate or unsubstantiated. So we do participate in the program, but I'm just highlighting those issues.
Thank you. Adrian, pass on that.
What they said.
Just what they said. Okay, last question, Lord Lucas.
If the government could do any one thing to ensure better informed levels of public debate in the digital age, what should that be?
It's the wrong question. I say that with great respect, but great seriousness as well. There is a tendency to see this issue as a problem for which we are looking for a solution. Mm-hmm. What it actually is a new area of policy which we will be debating for at least the next 30 years, in which we will end up with a different balance between free speech and harms, and different kinds of harms being considered than we have now. And I have no idea what the outcome of that discussion will be, but it's profoundly important and it needs to happen in a democratic context. The government is making a mistake of thinking that it can create some kind of statutory duty of care and then outsource all of those profound choices to a regulator, when actually they're democratic choices that need to be democratically debated. There is not a solution here, nor one step to be found. So that's my pushback to you. More broadly, I think we're missing the trick, which this committee, I think, has brought out. In accident prevention, there's something called the Swiss cheese model of accident prevention. The idea that everything has holes in it, but you don't find your way all the way through the block of Swiss cheese because the holes don't line up. So when a major accident happens in transport safety, people look for a whole chain of things that have gone wrong so that a catastrophe can occur. The opposite is true in this field. Being well informed is a remarkably surprising thing. You actually need somebody to have asked smart questions, good research, evidence gathering to have happened, that to have been communicated clearly, that to have reached someone who can reach large audiences and the audiences take it in. And every one of those steps is surprising. So actually we need to think about that whole ecosystem in a much more serious way and how we can promote informed debate at every step of it and stop looking for one answer to the problem.
I agree. I do think I'd like to see some action. Debate is great. I think 30 years of debate is going to put us in a really dangerous place. So I think whether or not it's an equivalent of COBRA for certain moments where we refer to the internet now as kind of hostile environments. So journalists have hostile environment training, and we now say that actually anyone working online should receive the same kind of support because the harassment and harm tips very much into disinformation and the threats and the challenges, and how that could very easily escalate offline around moments where people are scared or fearful, I think is a real issue. So I think rather than trying to tackle the whole problem, potentially looking at that definition of harm, as Will alluded to earlier, and what are those moments that we really are concerned about actually having a greater impact just through misinformation spiralling and escalating out of control, which is very possible.
Sorry, just to clarify on the basis of what Jenny said, my proposal is that you legislate little and often as we understand parts of this puzzle and be prepared to update that legislation as our understanding grows instead of trying to legislate once and for all.
Much of what Will said, to be honest. For me, it's about, as I mentioned previously, identifying those organisations that are well trusted, and thinking of synergetic ways of having them engage with fact-checking organisations, universities, research, just to, as Will explained, help promote that pathway of good information.
The challenge for you as your statutory body, what could we suggest?
Well, I was going to offer advice on the one thing that government could do, which is don't simply look outwards and negatively. So in my value chain, by all means, educate and support the hearers, by all means regulate the intermediaries, but also think about the government as a provider of information, and indeed spend as much time thinking about what it means to inform as it means to misinform.
Thank you very much indeed. Any last?
I'd just say, Will, that democratic pressure is working already. If you look at Google and you Google do vaccines cause autism, there's no in capital letters. If you ask, is 5G dangerous? It's about 50-50. And if you ask, is climate change real? It's clearly not happening.
Toby, not a question point.
I'll just go back to the point that Ed made earlier, and I should just declare my interest because I haven't spoken yet. I'm a board member of Cybersecurity Challenge, the chair of the Independent Reference Group of the National Crime Agency, and chair of National Trading Standards, none of which is to do with my question. You said earlier on that you were quite parsimonious about criticising political parties for that, and that you try to achieve balance. If, and I appreciate this is a rather large if, one party consistently misused statistics and another party never misused statistics, how would you achieve balance?
We don't have the objective of achieving balance, and if I conveyed that impression, that's wrong. I think if you looked at what we do, you would see that there is a balance, but we don't have a sort of a sense that if we've criticised one party, we've got to find a criticism of another. What we look at, in a way, we don't even, to use the football analogy, we don't even look at the player, we look at the ball. What are the statistics in question? Is there a risk that the statistical evidence base is being misinterpreted, misrepresented? And if it is, we will seek to clarify it.
Okay. Thanks. Anyone? Irish McGregor-Smith's got a final
comment, but I'm interested in all our debate. No one's talked about the fact that maybe what we should be doing with our people, with citizens, to say, come off all this stuff. Mm-hmm. You know, I've been saying that to my kids. They're off for a lot of things. You know, protect your privacy, protect you as the individual. There are things you can do to protect yourself. You don't need to be on everything. And this point on some of the social media feeds where you can get attacked, there's a very simple answer. Don't be on it. And you wouldn't open yourself up to attack walking down the road in the same way in the middle of the night. Why would you do that on the web? And why would young people listen to all of that? It's just an interesting point that it hasn't actually come up, but actually there's a whole piece of work I think that needs to be done around explaining to, particularly to young people, you don't need this in your lives. You don't need, we survived without a lot of it. You know, there are things you can do to support yourself, the individual, particularly against mental harm.
The opportunity to be more politically informed, more politically engaged, receive more accurate information because of the internet shouldn't be overlooked. So my concern is that the less people use some of these platforms, the less familiar they are with how they might be manipulated and how they might receive information. So if you are a regular user, then you're more likely to understand some of the etiquette or some of the challenges.
People particularly is, I know, well, certainly with my kids, they're coming off in droves. Because they want to protect themselves, and they want to protect themselves about what could be said on some of these platforms. And I think that is, yes, they're pretty tech savvy, but yes, I think that is a valid thing to be able to do.
Have you got any thoughts? Right to Baroness McGregor.
Right back to me if you want.
Thanks, guys, very, very much indeed. I'm sorry we've kept you.
The proceeding is currently suspended. 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 The proceeding...
I apologise for keeping you. We ran over. You'll be pleased to know it was a riveting conversation that you just missed. But it was good. Before we start, I have to read this. As you know, this session is open to the public. A webcast of the session goes out live and is subsequently accessible via the parliamentary website. A verbatim transcript will be taken of your evidence and put on the parliamentary website. You'll have the opportunity to make minor corrections for the purpose of clarification or accuracy. Perhaps you're good enough to introduce yourselves for the record, and then we'll begin with questions.
James Mitchinson, I'm the editor of the Yorkshire Post.
Jessica Cecil, I'm a director at the BBC.
Matthew Dancoma, I'm an editor and partner at Tortoise Media.
Thank you all very much, and thank you for being here. The first question is from Lord Mitchell.
Yes, good morning. Thank you for coming. This question probably needs about 3 months to answer, but we'll try and do it shorten that. So we'd like to know, how would you rate the current quality of public debate in the UK, and what effect has online misinformation had on public debate and levels of trust?
That's good.
Shall I start? We're very concerned. We're very concerned about the levels of misinformation and disinformation. And for the BBC, this is something that directly affects us. So, for instance, in the Indian elections last year, there were fake polls that purported to be from the BBC. So it's not just the message, but it's undermining our position as the messenger, and it makes a difference. So as a result, as you would expect, we're doing a lot to counter disinformation. Firstly, we produce trusted news, and we debunk fake news as part of that. Secondly, we work in partnership with other organisations. The Trusted News Initiative, working between platforms and publishers internationally, is one of those partnerships. And we help our audiences, for instance, through media education to navigate the environment.
I would say that there's been a crisis of trust, really at least since the crash, which has sort of tumbled through a series of institutions, the media with Leveson, Parliament with the Expenses Inquiry, and so on and so on. This is not historically unique, but what is unprecedented is its precise coincidence with a massive technological revolution, the consequences of which have been to universalise the means of production in information exchange. And this means that at the moment when traditional media organisations, political institutions are struggling with trust, the means to disrupt and subvert and offer new and unchallenged sources of authority has been completely explosive. Therefore, when you actually think about how most people go to get information, they go through a white box called Google. And when they go through it, they're entirely at the mercy of the algorithm. And it's very cheap to make a website look as good as the New York Times or the Atlantic or the London Times or the Guardian or whatever, which means that the normal semiotics of trust and authority are completely volatile. So I think this is fundamental. I don't think it's really a finger-pointing exercise. I think it's a structural crisis.
Yeah, I don't think all is lost, but I do think we are in a moment where the public is experiencing a sense of vertigo. They don't know who they can and can't trust, and it is for some of the reasons there. It isn't just about Brexit. It isn't just about the debate becoming polarised around that issue. This has been a insidious, progressive deterioration of trust between the establishment and the general public for a number of years, media included, I have to say. But I do think the debate has taken a lead from people in responsible positions. I've just been over at the Royal Institute listening to Amber Rudd talking about politicians who deign to campaign in poetry and govern in prose. And I think the public is desperate for politicians to leave the poetry to Keats and co. And offer them more of the prose and a more transparent, trustworthy lead, shall we say, from the top when it comes to the debate. But yes, I share my concerns with the panel that there is a fundamental dissolving of the trust contract that exists between the general public at large and those who seek to govern them.
Picking on what Matt's just said, and this struck me very forcibly, when David Cameron twice publicly apologised, once for Hillsborough, once Bloody Sunday, there was an almost explosion of relief. And if you like, we can interpret it as trust. And yet no politicians seem to learn from the fact that if you're prepared to say, what we were wrong, that actually the public, there is a sigh of relief, the public is encouraged to trust. Why do you think that, it's a brilliant, please give me one line answer, why do you think it might be that politicians so distrust the idea of apology, and indeed as do newspapers?
Partly, to be fair, because they've been brutalised by the media for so long every time they dare to say sorry, so one has to be fair on that point. But also I think because there's a whole concept of what it is to be a citizen, and so for example, I think citizens have been infantilised in two ways. One, by the notion that the state will sort out everything, and on the other hand, that in every respect they're a consumer. And this has broken the notion that there is something beyond this in the fabric of democracy, which can include, if you like, to take the old model of exit, voice and loyalty, where it's perfectly okay for a politician to say, actually, we got it wrong, just as it's okay for voters to admit that they might have got it wrong about a big issue. I won't name any, but there's one I can think of. And the sadness in this is that we've actually watched public discourse harden into a series of extremely robust statements one way or the other, to the extent that one cannot imagine John F. Kennedy saying, "Ask not what your country can do for you now," because his advisors would blue pencil it. Because asking citizens to do something, just as getting a politician to say sorry, is totally outside the rules of the game. Now, actually, I think members of the public like being asked to do things, and I think they like it when politicians are honest. I don't think this is a very difficult
problem to solve. But at the moment, there's a sort of a digital Mexican standoff, if you will, where none of this exists.
That was me taking advantage of being chair. Lord Mitchell's got a supplementary, and Lord Lucas has got a short follow-up.
I think it was. Did you say it was India who were passing themselves off as the BBC?
Not India. I mean, it was fake news that happened during the Indian elections.
Okay. So, but somebody's passing themselves off as you, and that must happen all the time, and it must be a growing issue. How do you deal with it? How do you make it unfake or legitimate?
Well, we have a number of things that we do. First of all, our name is very important, so we produce trusted news. We also debunk as much as we can the fake stories that we come across. During the Indian elections, for instance, talking about India, we had the reality check team out there looking at specific stories. We also have been working with tech platforms and global publishers to work out how we can have a fast alert system for disinformation during elections. And media education is clearly really, really important, so the public themselves are aware of when they should be asking questions about information they come across, and indeed when it's not advisable to pass that on to other people.
Thank you.
Lord Lucas.
What scope do you see for organisations like yours, and I'm thinking in particular of local media, of using the techniques that are there in platforms like Delib for local democracy to promote open discussion around a set of agreed information about particular issues? It's something that is starting to work very well in local government and around local government, but none of the news media seem to have taken this up at all. They seem not to be wanting to move beyond being fountains of authority rather than centres of debate.
In terms of adopting the technology, or in terms of adopting the spirit of debate?
It's an example of what works or what can work. But do you see it as something that could come across to the media as a way of allowing people to discuss an issue in depth rather than having to Google every time and deal with immediate disinformation?
We certainly do our best to encourage debate and exchanges of intelligent, constructive views. The challenge we face is, to Matt's point about the infantilisation of the debate and the propensity for people to gather around a viewpoint and defend it with a pitchfork until they die, regardless of how much evidence or how many alternative viewpoints or perspectives or, dare I say, facts are presented to them. And I think we absolutely do have a responsibility, you're right, collectively, to encourage a more intelligent, nuanced debate where, to Lord Putnam's point, there is space for people to fail, to make mistakes without having to make a catastrophic confession of guilt. And if we can encourage a more intelligent round of debate where nuance is permitted, then there shouldn't be a fear of failure and a catastrophic consequence. There should be acceptance and engagement with ideas and intentions that result in high quality actions that benefit communities. I would just like to pick up on the point about the rapid alert system. I think that's an area really worth pursuing when it comes to the social and tech platforms, because we experienced during the general election the incident of the boy on the floor of Leeds General Infirmary, where our story was done with the utmost professionalism. One of my journalists checked all of the facts. The story was verified by the hospital, and yet the narrative was able to be destabilised by fake media accounts, by people with sinister motives, and before any action was taken for the platform to confess that our story was true and the conspiracy theory was not, the damage was done. So I do think the rapid alert system actually is a very positive step forward and is one that should be explored further.
Well, I couldn't agree more. I think that what's interesting is how well it's worked on a number of cases. I mean, BBC's Andrew Marr shows a good example of how actually pitting politicians against what they've said in the past and having a sort of real-time fact-checking system can have a dramatic effect on the content. First of all, because it means it's you don't simply sort of get in ever-decreasing circles of what a question originally meant. But secondly, because you open it up and show, well, actually, this is you're not trying to censor anything, you're not trying to stop anything, but you're saying, hang on a second, this is the case, or this is what you said. And I think that's entirely new, and it's entirely to be welcomed. And it's an example of how the solutions to this don't necessarily have to involve, although they may eventually involve the global governance. You know, there are really quite granular solutions to some of these problems.
Second question from Lord Lipsey.
Thank you very much, Chairman. Can I declare an interest as a member of the ASA's Parliamentary Network and also as a former Deputy Chairman of Full Fact? Pretty evidently, the tech companies' line that they're just a conduit and what appears on their thing has nothing to do with them is rapidly eroding and may even be replaced by something laid down by government in the form of a duty of care or something. What I wanted to explore, and particularly for you, Matt, is this. We know the rules under which journalists operate in conventional media, certain restraints such as the law of libel, certain defences such as being able to protect your sources. We don't have a similar set of rules that apply to people, what can be published in this, and there's a very tricky balance to be struck between free speech on the one hand and the need not to abuse free speech, if there is such a thing, on the other. And I wondered what thoughts you had about what kind of regime might apply once we move to duty of care or something even stronger.
Well, it's the question, isn't it? I mean, I suppose the first thing one can say is what you don't want, which is to end up with a ministry of truth or off-truth. I don't think we want a regulator of falsity. I don't think that would work somehow. Part of the problem is that the available categories are insufficient. So patently, the platforms are not platforms in the sense that they're not neutral providers of anything that lands on them. And I think you're right to imply that, or to say that that the time when that was a sustainable argument is drawing to a close. Equally, though, they have a point when they say they're not publishers in the way that Little Brown is. You know, the amount of content that lands on their doorstep and is published is exponentially greater. So I think that there's a huge collective social task here, which is to come up with a, if I dare use the phrase, a third way, which is, and it involves jurisprudence and then legislation, which is to work out how it is when most information is mediated through a completely new form, you get to a situation where the harms that are being caused by this new form are at least mitigated, moderated, and where necessary sanctioned, but you don't have the clumsy fist of censorship too quickly. I don't think this is a swift task. I think it's intellectually quite complicated, and I think it actually it will involve legislation, but it will also involve a new way of thinking about how information is handled. I don't think the way to go forward is to create a great body that stamps out what are called political lies, because often what is called the political lie is really just a disagreement. I mean, errors of fact need to be always corrected. Libels need to be always punished in the courts of law, but there are problems that are unique to this technology, such as the fact that, you know, as we saw in the Christchurch horror, when content was being put online and then taken down, it was simply being put up again and again and again. So the tech companies aren't lying when they say that the problems of moderation are new. But that's not enough of an answer. The next answer is that how do you throw human resources at it, and how do you use up perhaps artificial intelligence as well to carry out some of the more rudimentary tasks of moderation. But I think one shouldn't underestimate the scale of this task.
Of course, in one particular case, Facebook, they've ruled a whole lot of stuff that appears, namely anything political, is totally out with any form of moderation or taking down of it, which is a very extreme position.
It is, and I think that that sort of position won't be sustainable. Of course, one of the problems here is jurisdictional, that Facebook has chosen artfully to align itself with the First Amendment. Facebook in Germany is very different. So we need to be conscious. I think there's a very... I think Jamie Susskind makes this point very well in his book Future Politics, which is that whilst we all want a sort of universal solution to this, that we may, in the first instance, have to settle for national ones. And I think that's absolutely right.
Jessica?
I think, like Matt, we fundamentally stand for freedom of expression, and we don't want to do anything to undermine that. That said, we are all subject to regulation. We at the BBC are subject to the regulation of the Ofcom Broadcasting Code under impartiality and due accuracy. And so we support the Online Harms White Paper's suggestion of regulation because even if it is unwittingly, clearly platforms have the ability to carry misinformation and disinformation. And there should be exploration of what that regulatory framework should be and what the codes of conduct should be. But like Matt, this is going to be a big and difficult task, I think.
You won't be surprised to hear I'm in agreement that rather than attempting to police the, dare I say, wild west of misinformation, because it's just too big, there's too much of it. I think much better to settle on perhaps a legislative or regulatory framework, perhaps even technological solutions that help to draw people's attention to and increase the prominence of trusted news sources and information, and to bring to the fore of the likes of Google and Facebook journalism from trained professionals.
Guy, can I ask you if you'd like to come in on this, because it's an area actually you know more about the rest of us. Well, I'm particularly intrigued, and Matt's raised the issue of whether this might require national rather than international, rather than global agreements. How do you feel about that?
Very happy to do that. I'm afraid I'll just have to run through the interests first.
Oh, sorry.
So we may be here for half an hour. So I declare interest as Deputy Chairman of the Telegraph Media Group, Director of the Regulatory Funding Company, Director of the Advertising Standards Board of Finance, Chair of the Commonwealth Press Union, and Vice Chair of the APPG on media freedom. It was very interesting to hear the comments on the online harms white paper, following on from Lord Lips's point about what happens if you actually just classify these companies as publishers, because immediately then they're responsible to for all sorts of regulations, copyright, privacy, that you all are. But do you think that the way that the online harms white paper was couched is just talking about how difficult it's going to be? It is just so wide that effective legislation resulting from it is going to be very difficult to achieve. And is there a case for having actually a much more slimmed down version of that, which really targets the platforms?
Yeah, well, my view is that the online harms white paper, I do think that the trusted sources of news and information would require some sort of journalistic exemption. Otherwise, I fear a healthy, prosperous free press might be threatened by that paper. Quite how you apply that to billions of exchanges per day on a social platform is beyond me, and I do think it would perhaps be folly to pursue that weapon, if you like, in the fight against misinformation and fake news. I just don't feel that it would be an effective way of tackling the problem.
Especially as the chairman pointed out, this is an international issue, it's not a domestic one.
Yep. And the digital information marketplace, as we found recently, when our story again of the boy on the hospital floor went international, the digital marketplace isn't a national one, it's an international one.
Yeah.
I'm not sure there's a huge amount more I want to... We welcome discussion and what the regulator looks like and tackling some of the issues that Matt and James have talked about national versus international regulation. But I don't think at this point we can add very much more.
I think there's a very important point, which is that we must never see the question of regulation as distinct from, as it were, the supply side issue, which is none of this will be of any use if we're not teaching digital literacy systematically to children from the age of 3. And right quick, because they're entering, I mean, it's not even they are in a world in which the primary source of their information is digital. The only source, probably, for many of them. And we teach children how to analyse texts and how to understand graphs, and yet really we're only in the infancy of teaching them how to understand what to trust, how to analyse what they see in the much more perplexing world of online information. This seems to me to be a primary educational challenge, and to raise a generation of citizens who are not only digital natives but digitally literate. And no amount of regulation can combat an absence of that literacy.
Very much. Question 3.
In a sense, my question is a subset of the question you've just answered, which is there any value in treating political content differently from this sort of swathe of other content? And if there is, would it be useful to have a regulator that deals specifically with political content? And how would you go about identifying what is and isn't political content? So it's a subsection. Would it be useful if we had that category in order to identify, verify, and perhaps push it up the food chain?
I do think so. People don't mind political content when they know it's political content. When the Rubicon is crossed is, for example, when CCHQ Twitter account morphs into a fact-checking service and purports to be an exponent of the truth and reality, or the Keir Starmer video that was doctored on Good Morning Britain to make him appear incompetent, or, at risk of sounding a little bit twee, the local newspapers that picked up the design, look, feel and tone of my local newspapers that have served local communities for generations, 3 times more trusted than social media. They received political pravdas through the letterbox that said, welcome to your brand new free local newspaper. And that was political propaganda. So I do think there should be a review into the nature, the type of political literature that is published by political parties, particularly during election campaigns. And I would welcome some sort of agreement or acquiescence to a code of conduct that prevents in the future the electorate being asked to select who might govern them without being able to discern truth from lies, even through their own letterbox.
It's worth bearing in mind that the Act that regulates all this, PPER, was passed in the year 2000, which is 4 years before Mark Zuckerberg sat in his bedroom and invented Facebook, and 5 years before smartphones became, generally available. The problem with that Act is that it's not its weakness, but its blindness. It simply doesn't see a lot of the problems, that James is describing. It doesn't. And why would it? That certainly is an urgent legislative task. That Act and the Commission with it need to be updated to be fit for purpose.
Jessica.
I wouldn't want to be drawn in talking about how campaigns are regulated, but I think there's a flip side to this, which is that a free and vibrant press is the best way of holding politicians to account. It's what James does, it's what Matthew does, and it's what we do at the BBC. And scrutinising the accuracy of political statements is absolutely core to what we do every day, and particularly during elections. And the scrutiny of the online campaign was a particular focus for us this time around. And, you know, as a result, James talked about his trust scores, and, you know, the BBC, 51% of adults turn to the BBC for news they can trust the most, and that is a hard-won reputation that we have to protect.
So even though you're all reluctant to say there should be a political regulator, you are, am I right in understanding your answer to say that there is something that is called political content that may require a less blind look around it and take account of current norms? Because you said code of conduct, you stopped short of saying regulate.
Our view is quite simple in that I think the public do not mind political content when they know it's political content. Yeah. And they want to be able to make an informed decision about the politicians that they might approve to govern them. And what they don't like is political propaganda masquerading as quite something else. That I think is the crux of where I'm coming from, and to help us be that sort of prosperous, thriving, free, local press that is able to scrutinise local MPs for the long-term future. I think my sort of plea to this committee would be to ensure that the tech companies, the platforms, gives a fair deal for the content that they carry on their platforms, because we are not receiving anywhere near the level of revenue that the hard work, the diligence, the professionalism, the training, the development, the time taken to produce that content merits. And so I would genuinely like to see the size of the revenue made by the tech platforms, and then contemplate how we go about distributing that more fairly.
We will come on very much to that point, James, in a few minutes. Jessica, one quick question, without you being self-critical. You've been at the BBC a while, done very senior jobs. What can you think of something that's totally sideswiped you from the digital environment that you and none of your colleagues expected and are having to deal with on a day-to-day basis? What's been the most difficult and unexpected aspect of the world you're now dealing with, as opposed to the world you were dealing with 10 years ago?
I think it's to do with the fact that there are now a multiplicity of sources of information, and our role is not just to inform people, but it's to help them navigate across those sources. And 10 years ago, there were relatively few news providers. Now there are many, and as we've heard, some of them can and some of them can't be trusted. And I think it's the multiplicity of sources, and therefore the role that we have to play in navigation as well as information.
That's very helpful. Lord Harris, the fourth question.
You all talked about your role in holding politicians to account and the importance of a free press. So what level of fact-checking should we be expecting from you, from news organisations, on the claims that are made?
Very high. And I mean, I think, you know, speaking for my trade, that I'm thrilled by the development of the fact-checking industry. I think it's been one of the most exciting sort of spontaneous things that have happened in this whole debate. But let's be honest, it's also an indictment of the journalistic trade, because fact-checking used to be called journalism. So whilst I welcome it, I'm conscious of it as something of a, you know, an indictment on us collectively. I think there are two elements of this. I mean, I think to your point, of course, you know, the most important point in any inquisition, inquiry, interview with a politician is to make sure they're telling the truth. And it may be in the past that there's been too much effort to have, as it were, pseudo-balanced panels rather than to conduct a kind of Socratic inquiry so you get to the truth. But the second thing is that we also have to acknowledge that facts are not enough. The way in which you present the facts and the accessibility thereof and the way in which they are presented, so that they are, as it were, digestible and clear, is equally important. The lesson of political culture in the last 10 years is that story matters at least as much as evidence. And this presents journalists with a tremendous problem, because how do you tell stories without bias? I don't have a glib answer to that, but I do think that it's not simply enough to produce a wonderful data visualization. You have to find ways of making clear why this fact is a fact and this is a lie. And I think we have been we've fallen short in that regard, and also fallen short in calling out lies. And I think we're getting better, but we've got a lot more work to do.
Is that true for all of you? All of the media? I mean, it strikes me that in the recent general election, for example, all the major parties made tendentious comments about each other, and in some instances those were just reported as this is it, this is what's being said. Is it sufficient simply to say, well, this is a Conservative Party statement, or this is a Labour Party statement, or this is a Liberal Democrat statement, and leave the reader or the listener or the viewer to say, well, they would say that anyway? Or do you have a duty to say, well, yes, this is a completely tendentious statement made by the Conservative Party or the Labour Party or the Liberal Democrats?
We worked very hard during the election to ensure that there was real-time fact-checking. So during the leaders' debate, for instance, there was real-time fact-checking, which has been built on as this has become more and more something that we need to address. And also very, very robust interviewing by our very experienced broadcasters. So I would say we do an awful lot of fact-checking and checking, and when subsequently the public were asked about the most accurate and trustworthy news provider during the election, they said it was the BBC for those very reasons. I think we have adapted what we do to the environment in which we now find ourselves.
But the BBC also, for example, on Question Time, allows comments from the questions from the audience to sit there completely unchallenged and wait to see if one of the panel responds to that.
I think very robust questioning. I don't particularly want to talk about one particular programme, as I'm sure you can imagine, but we do a lot through our journalists who are extremely seasoned, as well as real-time and after-the-fact fact-checking, so that people, our audiences, get a good view of what is true and what isn't.
From the Yorkshire Post.
Certainly at the regional press level, we pride ourselves on the level of training NCTJ qualified journalists. We are independently regulated to world-class standards. The amount of time I spend responding to IPSO complaints, touch wood, none of which I've fallen foul in the last 20 years, is significantly higher than it was under the previous regulator. But I do think now is a good moment for the standoff, the skirmish between media and politicians to come to an end. I don't think it's healthy for the government to boycott the Today programme and the BBC. I think we all benefit from having long-form, detailed scrutiny of politicians. If I may give another example, the newly appointed chair of the Treasury Select Committee, Mel Stride, has blocked 2 or 3 of my journalists in the last week or so. So we're unable to ask constructive criticisms, well-meant questions on behalf of the people who politicians represent. So I think that this is a good moment for this protracted war between the state and the media to come to an end, because I just don't think it's helpful.
Could I just probe very briefly the question of balance? Sometimes news organisations appear. Let's take a hypothetical argument that we're debating whether or not the world is round, and you would feel it necessary, some of you, to have a representative of the Flat Earth Society to say, "Oh no, it's not." Now, how do you define at what point should you be striking balance? At what point should you say, actually, this is the facts, this is what it's really all about?
The BBC has our editorial guidelines and guidance, and impartiality is absolutely fundamental to that. But it is due impartiality. So on issues like climate change, we ensure that we take into account impartiality in the light of what science tells us.
I think policy, editorial judgment are at the heart of that. I do think we, the Yorkshire Post, are able to be much more determined when it comes to shutting down the flat earthers, shutting down the Holocaust deniers, shutting down the climate change deniers. I think there are certain issues and topics where the science and the facts are indisputable and the debate is not necessary.
And if I may, Chair, you're entitled to ask one slightly different question. What is your role, or do you have a role, or do you have any anxieties about breeding cynicism on the political process by, if you like, the why is this lying bastard lying to me approach, which is sometimes taken to politicians? Do you sometimes go too far to breed a cynicism which in itself undermines democracy?
I think that there has been, I'm not sure it's quite as bad as it has been in the past, there has been a sort of gotcha approach, which is the purpose of an interview is to catch a politician out, rather than to have a debate about what's going on, what the policy might be, and that a good interview is one in which someone is made to look an idiot. And of course, that's a ridiculous journalistic test. It must be said that the gravitational pull of social media means that it's a great way of getting onto Twitter. So we have to be aware of that. But we must be absolutely wary of that, because, I mean, cynicism is the rust on all of this, and the media has a role in ensuring that it's not the case. I think I've never agreed with the "why is this lying bastard lying to me" line, because I don't start from the proposition that anyone is lying to me. On the other hand, if I think they are, I'll call them out, and that seems to me a perfectly reasonable way of approaching it. But yeah, I mean, the premise of your question is absolutely right.
Let's move on to Baroness McGregor-Smith.
Just before I start my question, I just want to reflect on some of the conversations. And James, really, I'm a huge admirer and hugely respect the Yorkshire Post. Certainly in all my business dealings, when I was chief executive, I felt the trade press definitely had the kind of, not just the integrity, but the scrutiny I would have expected in different parts of the country. So huge admirer. But actually, when I listened to the story of the young child on the hospital floor, firstly, it's interesting. I didn't actually realise it was written by you. Secondly, I think I picked it up on the BBC, and then later that day, I think I heard again that it was a risk of fake news, which I thought may or may not have come from the BBC. So I've assumed the story until today was fake. So it's just interesting as to, I was obviously quite busy, I didn't go into the detail. There are so many stories flying, and it is quite a big question, therefore, as to how do you as journalists actually argue when it is definitely a true story, how you get that message back to the public. I certainly had always assumed it was fake. It's just a just an observation. But I think I was going through that campaign and assuming most of what I was hearing was fake as well, so I was feeling quite cynical myself. But anyway, that's just a general point. But just moving on to social media, what do you think journalists, posts on social media should be subjected to in terms of scrutiny? Do you think they should have the same standards as formalised reporting? So social media, would you have the same standards as published formalised reporting or not?
First of all, thank you for your kind words. Secondly, yes, I don't necessarily think there needs to be another regulatory code. I, as an editor, insist on the highest standards. I insist on the social media activity to be in line with the editor's code, in line with the editorial standards that we set. And if I give you a live example, a member of my staff tweeted what I constituted to be unprofessional, borderline abuse of a social media company managing communications for a rail company in our neck of the woods, and you may well be familiar with the challenges we have with the rail services in the north. But he was taken into my office and it was made clear in no uncertain terms that the expectations and the standards we set for the newspaper are no different to Twitter or anywhere else on social media. So I absolutely believe that we should hold ourselves up to the highest possible standards regardless of where we publish.
Could I just ask a supplementary? What about if it's in a personal? It's the personal. I mean, because kind of the issue about this is, if you tweet in a personal capacity, something which is maybe not true, or the reach now is so wide through social media. So do you draw a line between personal account or stories which are part? Is there any delineation that you use?
Potentially in a conversation, but when an account very clearly states an individual is working for the Yorkshire Post, I think it is not unreasonable to expect higher standards than somebody who isn't identified as working for the Yorkshire Post. And I do think actually, to Matt's point about this being a long-term structural societal challenge that begins in primary schools, we should all behave much better on social media. I don't accept that you can hide behind the veil of this is a personal view in order to start throwing toxicity around on social media.
It raises the whole issue of anonymisation. Baroness Morris.
This is a really interesting area, and I think part of my problem is the three people we've got answering the questions all behave very, very well. So, but not all, as we said before, not all your profession behaves very well. So I'm just trying to. So while I'm listening to your answers, I'm absolutely agreeing with it from your mouths, but I'm thinking this is not the world which affects so many citizens in terms of them. Getting information to make the judgment. I wonder if you could comment on that, and I'm not asking you to criticise colleagues, but from our committee's point of view, how we differentiate. And the thing that's really made me ask the question was the social media, because I'm not, if I read an article in a newspaper, I don't then read the comments underneath. I just don't do that. That's not, I want to read comments, I'll somehow go somewhere else. So I was quite surprised and very impressed, James, that you said you'd hold them to the same account, and it left me sort of wondering if you were what I would call mainstream media, an article newspaper or BBC, which I read their news channel a lot, is the only difference between getting your journalists to respond to the comments, because I'm told that that's part of their appraisal, how much they put on Twitter underneath the article that they've written, is the only thing that it's a different outlet, because I thought there was a different purpose to that, and that's why I don't read it. I thought that was a different thing. It doesn't have the same purpose of BBC or what I would trust from that journalist. And the way I think I've always interpreted that is, that's Polly Toynbee as a person. I've just read her article. I don't think I want to go into that. That's not a very concise question, but it's just an area that sort of is in the back of my mind, following your answers to those questions. I wonder if you could help me sort it out.
I think, like James, we take what our journalists say on social media extremely seriously, and there's absolutely no difference for our journalists in what they say in social media and the very high standards that we hold them to as if they were broadcasting on radio or television, and our guidelines and guidance that has that is the framework within which they work has adapted as the environment has adapted. But to stand back and answer your question, we have to make sure that we stand for the trusted news organisation that we represent, and we remain a trusted news organisation.
And you're more regulated than most.
And we're regulated, and that's the way we choose to make sure that we uphold those values.
Yes, I mean, I think that it's a really important question, and in a way we're not necessarily the best people to work. I mean, James is a famously rigorous editor, Jessica represents the BBC, where there are such strict guidelines on social media, and I hope Tortoise carries that through. But here there is a problem, which is this: that to a greater extent than I think we'd perhaps like to admit, social media is media now, in the sense that it's the gateway to other media, and unfortunately, the way to amplify yourself on social media is to be shrill rather than accurate. Now, I find it quite easy to resist that temptation because of what I do, but others representing broadcast or print formats are under considerable pressure to get clicks on Twitter or other newer platforms to guide people back into their traditional format. So this is not a straightforward question. It's people tend to see who aren't digital natives tend to see social media as something you do at the end, to almost like a trailer. But to a large extent, social media now is the gateway into the information ecosphere, and it's the advertising shop window, and the person screaming loudest can do best. So I think far be it from me to speak on behalf of the BBC, but I think the BBC does amazingly well. For instance, there was a question asked the other day about the Lawrence Fox incident on Question Time, and whether that was a put-up job by the BBC in order to draw traffic into Question Time. Now, I'm as sure as I can be, and Jessica would know better, but that it absolutely wasn't. But the fact that that question was asked, irrespective of the BBC, tells you how the thing works, which is that you manufacture a row, and then you draw people into your print or broadcast thing. Now that's a big issue, and I think a lot of this has to do with it comes down to how Twitter accounts are labelled. I always think food labelling has given us quite a good template to work on, which is what is this account? Is this the journalists speaking on behalf of themselves or on behalf of the programme? There are no such labels appear. It's time we had more kite marking in the digital world, and things evaluated so that people who see it can see actually this is just someone speaking in a personal capacity or not. And again, I think we're in the very foothills of learning how to do that.
From Lord Scriven. It's actually a very, very, from our point of view, as committee, a very important question. So, James, if you could be as full as possible on this. Paul?
Make no comment about the Yorkshire Post, being a Yorkshire person on the committee. Look, what's clear, people go and gain information through different sources, and particularly break down by ethnicity or by social class or by age. And social media and the online world is becoming more and more important, which is driven by a business model and algorithms about where things are placed and how people view the information that they go to see. So my kind of two questions on this is, first of all, has this affected the viability of the news media in its present form, and particularly at a local level for local media? And secondly, what should technology companies do so to ensure that individuals can access high quality journalism, and particularly local journalism?
Has it impacted upon the way we do business, yes, it has. The conversation we've just had about social media and its purpose, one of the purposes is to amplify the content to as big a possible audience, to generate as much revenue as possible in the programmatic world. What that has led to, and I'm not including the Yorkshire Post in this, but there is a real danger that homogenises output, and it homogenises it around that which generates the most clicks rather than that which is most in the public interest or is likely to be to the betterment of any given community. And the business model in that vein is one that has seen in the last decade, I think, half of the output generated by local news papers and websites is diminished, and probably irretrievably. What can be done to assist in this? Kite marking absolutely is one way. There are, of course, blue tick accounts on Twitter and on Facebook, but that isn't necessarily an indicator of journalism that's been done to the highest possible standards, is independently regulated and thoroughly fact-checked. There is an acute, if not urgent, requirement for the tech platforms to, as I said previously, distribute the revenue generated from the content that we produce more fairly and in a way that we can reinvest into our products, into our digital technology, into creating, to Lord Lucas's point, really user-friendly environments where people can engage in the debate and feel like a stakeholder in society rather than being on the outside. That for me is the priority, that redistribution of the wealth generated by work done by people employed by the regional news.
And do you have a view of what that system, how that system should be formulated, James?
I don't, but I could formulate one and write back to you.
What are the principles that would guide it? Are there any principles that you have if it's not in depth?
I think the first step is to size the pot. So how much has I think Facebook's display advertising in the UK last year was £2 billion. The search revenue generated by Google last year was £6 billion. And that is gargantuan in comparison with the regional press, and yet I strongly suspect that a significant proportion of that revenue comes off the back of toil done in our centres. So I would reiterate that plea to size that revenue, and we're not after a handout, we're just after a structural redistribution of a fair amount of the revenue that comes off the back of our content.
Jessica, what could the BBC do using its digital facilities to support local accountability?
We do quite a lot. I mean, James has talked about the economic issues. We have been running for a few years our local democracy reporters scheme with up to £8 million of BBC money paid, and that pays for 150 local reporters who produce local accountability journalism, reporting on councils across the United Kingdom. Those stories are then available to local news providers, and we reckon that they reach about 8 to 10 million people a week. We are keen to see that expanded, and we have Tony Hall, the Director General, has talked about the expansion of that particular scheme, but we can't afford to put any more money in, and we're very keen that tech platforms, amongst others, help us to extend the local accountability journalism that we're talking about, extending it to more councils, extending it to, for instance, NHS trusts, and where there are no market implications to courts.
If we were to press, as a committee, Paul's been very good on this, for some form of, and I'm making this up as I go along here, a digital levy, whereby the big digital companies were helping underpin local accountability, reporting of courts, reporting of planning decisions. between you, do you have any thoughts about how that could be implemented, how it could be fairly used and be transparently used so that people understood that their lives would be made richer, in a sense, by some form of digital subvention?
Well, as I say, the Local Democracy Reporter Scheme expansion that we've talked about, which has actually been endorsed by the Cairncross, the government, by the government's response to Cairncross review yesterday, we would say that would be our preferred way of increasing the local accountability journalism. And as I say, 8 to 10 million people reached a week suggests that this is what people are interested and want to know about. And traditionally, as James has said, this is something that local media had the means to cover.
Two last words, Lord Scriven, then Barris Kidron.
James, you offered to send something into the committee. If you could do that, that would be helpful, a broader picture. I don't know whether yours is still on the levy or a revenue, but beyond that, is there anything else that you think the technology companies, social media or platforms could do? I mean, there's issues about where things are placed, the algorithms, etc. There's issues possibly that you could think about which is more collaborative, about partnerships that you could work. Is there anything else that you can feel which would underpin good journalism? I'm particularly looking at the local level rather than the national level.
Well, it's interesting how algorithms, the one way to make someone from a tech platform put down their smoothie, put away their yoga ball, and look at you in a very cross way is to mention the word algorithm. That's the black box of this whole conundrum, and they don't want to open it. And I'm looking forward to the first person on the planet that gets them to do so, because it will happen. We know already that algorithms bake in prejudice to systems, that they reinforce prejudice, and they shut down debate. So much as they also direct us towards the things we like, they're useful, they tell us things we want to buy, information we want, and so on. So they're not uniformly wicked. They are the most powerful system in the world today. And so I'm totally in favour of a digital levy hypothecated for, and by the way, not just local news, but also money towards digital literacy, because we need to teach teachers how to teach. But I think until government and democratic representatives can force tech companies to say more about algorithms, conscious of their commercial confidentiality and so on, this debate will stall. It has stalled because you simply cannot get them to talk about it.
I think just to add, we're seeing our relationship with our audiences increasingly mediated by the platforms, and we are concerned that the discoverability of trusted news is protected. There's due attribution, so you know it comes from the BBC with all the Yorkshire Post, and that it can be seen in the environment of curation. So instead of filter bubbles, you have a sense that you are seeing all of the top stories.
I think there's a final question from Lord Black, but I think you've in a sense all answered it. Guy?
Thank you. If I could make a very quick observation just on that last question, which is obviously of fundamental importance. There is quite a lot of stuff in the Cairncross review about how local journalism could be supported by the platform, suggestions of coded conduct and so forth. It's an area the CMA is looking at. And the difficulty with it, I suspect, is that it's impossible to see, and Matt referenced this really, how to get the platforms to the table to talk about it without the threat of legislation. Legislation takes a while. As we know, the problems of the local press are here and now. They're not in 3 years' time. So that's the problem with it. So this is just the magic wand moment, really. If the government could do just any one single thing, we'll have to limit you just to one, to ensure better informed levels of public debate in the digital age. What would you choose?
I would choose that the government supports a vibrant, free press in this country. I think we're incredibly fortunate that we have a diverse ecosystem. We're obviously a part of that, and for us, the secure funding of the BBC is a key part of the way in which we are able to deliver the news to inform and help our audiences navigate. And in that context, clearly talk about decriminalisation of the licence fee is of concern, because the government's own independent review in 2015 showed that, one, it wasn't advisable, and secondly, it's likely to cost the BBC around £200 million, which would clearly have an effect on the content of our journalism.
Well, I agree with all that Jessica said, but I'd also like to add, I do think the next budget should have a digital levy in it. I'd love to see, I mean, the government, though it's been in power for quite a long time, keeps referring to itself as a new government, and which is exciting. And I think in that spirit it would be nice for it to do something along the lines of the new Labour government's windfall tax, and influence and introduce, but not a windfall tax, a digital levy in the first budget of the new Parliament.
Thank you. James, last word.
I do agree that I too would support the digital levy as part of the next budget. I would also press home that need for regional and local press to receive a fair deal for the revenue generated by the content they produce.
Thank you very, very much indeed. I'm sorry we've run 20 minutes over. It's been, from my point of view, certainly hugely valuable. Our next meeting is next Tuesday, 10 o'clock. And thank you very, very much for spending time with us. Thank you.
Proceeding has ended. The proceeding has ended. The proceeding has ended. The proceeding has ended.